darkest days of the great Roman Empire, a barbarian horde rose up to claim a land of its own. Hungry for power, fiercely pagan, their culture thrived on treachery, blood feuds, and merciless brutality. They came as raiders, but their name endures, etched on the land itself. The thunder of their conquest echoed across a continent, their legacy around the world, for they were the Saxons, the warrior kings. At the end of the 4th century, a savage group of barbarian mercenaries haunted the margins of northern Europe. They were called the Saxons. Constantly waging war on their neighbors, they lived for glory and gold.
If you're rich in gold, you have the very best warriors at your service. If your reputation is at the very top of reputations in the barbarian world, you attract the very best followers.
With a reputation as mighty warriors, they made excellent recruits for the Roman army.
Saxons had been used in the Roman army for some time, so part of the population is well-trained according to Roman standards. They became highly militarized.
Their villages stretched along the often inhospitable coast of the North Sea. Infamous pirates, they terrorized both sides of the channel. When Saxon warriors made preparations for a raid, their entire community rallied behind them, full of admiration and respect.
To begin.
But even the warlord acknowledged the authority of the pagan priest, for only he knew how to win the goodwill of the gods.
They're very similar to Viking or Norse peoples in their mythology, and so central gods and goddesses occasionally appear, especially Odin or Wotan.
Pagan rituals had brought the Saxons success in battle, but then their luck began to change. They believed that animal sacrifice encouraged the gods to crush their enemies, but nothing could help them against nature itself. Flooding was wreaking havoc in their lands.
The coastal areas, in some senses, are being inundated by storm surges and are adversely affected by climate change. Many of the coastal settlements that seem to be growing in the 3rd and 4th centuries simply stop at the end of the 4th century.
As their villages were washed away, the Saxons had to pick up and move on. They joined a continent full of barbarians on the march. The migrations brought endless hardship, battle, and exile. They also bred a burning desire in the hearts of 2 small brothers, Hengist and Horsa, who, according to legend, were to lead their people to a new and better home. Across the turbulent North Sea lay a promising land, Britain, at the northwest edge of the Roman Empire. For 400 years, the Romans had ruled Britain with an iron fist. But when barbarians attacked Rome itself, they suddenly decided to abandon the island. Thousands of troops were called back to defend Rome's heartland, leaving the Britons to face terrible danger alone.
They were threatened not only by each other, but they were threatened by predatory peoples who surrounded them, in particular the Picts from the north, the Irish from Ireland, and these raiders were devastating Britain.
In their Roman Roman-style villas, the British aristocracy were repeatedly ravaged by Pict invaders. Fierce warriors from Scotland, the Picts had the Britons in a tight corner, according to 6th century monk Gildas.
The barbarians push us back to the sea. The sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered.
There were too few Roman troops to protect them. When the Britons appealed to Rome for more, they were cruelly refused. To the Romanized Britons, it must have seemed like the end of the world. The countryside was racked by famine, and civil war broke out.
The Britons took over control of their military, of their government, things that the Romans had provided for them. And the question is, were they capable of doing so? Eventually, militarily, they felt they weren't.
A surviving soldier rushed to report the latest defeat to the British nobles. Desperate and confused, the aristocracy were controlled by one ambitious man. His name was Vortigern.
Vortigern is a shadowy figure because his name comes from later records. He's called earlier on the Tyrannus Superbus, the most arrogant tyrant. But he was probably a king of some sway over much of the island.
Vortigern proposed a very Roman solution to the problem of the Picts: mercenaries. Fortuitously, just across the North Sea, there was a barbarian tribe armed and ready to fight: the Saxons.
It's easy to be critical looking backwards at Vortigern. What a crazy thing to do, to invite the Anglo-Saxons, who must have already been raiders and pirates and part of the military problem, and then trying to think that I can make them part of the military solution. It's difficult to imagine what else he could have done. What could have been the harm of inviting 3 shipfuls of Anglo-Saxons into an island of millions of people? How could poor Vortigern have anticipated what was going to happen?
In 449, 3 ships of Saxons were said to have made the sea crossing. Along an ancient Roman bulwark, the Picts and Saxons clashed. The Saxons were led by the brothers, Hengist and Horsa, now full-grown warlords.
What we're talking about is largely a male migration, and a migration of warriors, individuals who have already been trained either by the Romans, fought alongside the Romans, and probably were armed very much like the late Roman army. These were individuals who knew about warfare.
Like Romans, the Saxons advanced behind shields. The Picts rushed helter-skelter into the fray. The Saxons pushed the Picts back to the highlands for good. The British lord, Vortigern, celebrated with a lavish feast in honor of his new allies. But sharing a table with Saxons disgusted his nobles.
Wir bisschen ein sehr, sehr derbers anfragen, dass du zwei.
Still, Vortigern believed the Saxons would serve him well, as long as he rewarded them handsomely.
When the Saxons were hired as mercenaries, they were given food, they were given supplies, money, and maybe some land, but they wanted more.
As Saxon numbers increased, so did Hengist and Horsa's ambitions. The next wave of Saxon ships carried not only warriors, but also women and children.
The initial migration to Britain was not large at all. After that is a secondary migration, which would have numbered in much larger numbers, tens of thousands.
Among the immigrants was Hengist's own daughter, the beautiful Rowena. Smitten with a pagan princess, Vortigern swore he would give anything to marry her. Hengist demanded a spectacular price for his daughter. All the lands that made up the southeastern corner of Britain, the region now known as Kent. The disgruntled Britons saw Vortigern's union with a pagan as blasphemous. This uneasy alliance was heading for disaster. And before long, the Saxons were to write their names across the green British countryside in blood. Lord Vortigern, leader of the Britons, had thrown many of his nobles off their lands and given them to Saxon mercenaries as payment. Even worse, he had taken a pagan bride.
The Britons were Christian and had been for more than a century, and they were heirs then to a Christian culture and to a Roman culture. So these Saxons appeared very alien to them, both ethnically as well as culturally. The Saxons are described as barbarians who are not much different than animals. They're described in animal imagery, often compared to dogs and savages.
Vortigern's troubles multiplied at harvest time. His serfs couldn't grow enough food to meet the increasing needs of the barbarians.
The climatic deterioration that's making poorer cereal crops, the cutting off of trade, which is probably repressing or reducing agricultural productivity. Outright famine means that the Britons cannot simultaneously feed themselves and feed the Anglo-Saxons.
Vortigern failed to pay the food tribute to his hired troops, thereby breaking the Saxons' warrior code.
This is a world in which every injury has to be avenged. What happens when a bad king doesn't give rewards to his followers, doesn't give them wealth, but instead gives them injury? Then the bad king can only expect vengeance. Because a man would not be a man if he couldn't take the vengeance.
Saxon vengeance was furious and swift. A century later, the memory was still fresh for British monk Gildas.
All of the major towns are laid low. Swords glinted all around and the flames crackled, while holy altars and fragments of corpses were covered with a purple crust of congealed blood.
Vortigern was held responsible for the disaster and murdered by his own nobles. But his death didn't end the Saxon dilemma.
The Britons came to think of the Saxons as untrustworthy, that they were duplicitous, and that led to a long series of not just military conflicts, but social conflicts as well.
There were reprisals on both sides. Even the great Saxon warlord Horsa, brother of Hengist, was cut down in battle. Finally, Hengist called a truce. The negotiations took place on Salisbury Plain, under the towering pillars of Stonehenge. Legend has it that the Britons came unarmed to parley for peace, an old and honourable custom, but a custom not followed by the Saxons. Hidden in their boots, the Saxons carried the notorious long knives called saxes. The Saxons fell upon the unsuspecting Britons. At the Night of the Long Knives, as it came to be known, Hengist cut out the heart of British resistance.
I think Hengist is the most fascinating character of the migration stories. A man who betrays, a man who leads, a man who somehow emerges as a powerful and trusted figure despite the treasons. And he's the beginner of the Anglo-Saxons in England.
Hengist is said to have ruled in Kent for 30 years before dying of natural causes in 488. Before long, other Saxon warlords came seeking opportunity.
Early on, there were a lot of Saxon war bands and Saxon military units who were out to get land for themselves, for their chieftain.
They flooded in, bent on claiming a new home. The British aristocracy fled to the highlands that ring the western edges of the island. The Britons who lived there came to be known as Welsh, the Saxon word for stranger. The boldest of the new crop of Saxon warlords was Ella. He pursued the Britons to their strongholds, the supposedly impregnable Roman fort towns.
The armies are small. Warfare between armies might be 60 men facing 80 men, and maybe the analogy for most of the warfare in the 5th century would be closer to deadly gang fight than what we think of as infantry divisions matched against each other. The scale of warfare is very small and very personal.
The Britons were no match for the Saxons, according to the 9th century Anglo-Saxon chronicle.
Ella besieged Endereda, the Roman fort of Pevelty, and slew all that were therein. Not one Briton was there left.
But the tables were to be turned by one of the greatest military minds of the age. The brilliant British general, Ambrosius Aurelianus. In the last years of the 5th century, he roused his countrymen to defend their homes and their civilized way of life. According to legend, Ambrosius was assisted by a dynamic warrior prince who, through time, has become known as Arthur.
We don't have any contemporary evidence for King Arthur as a historical figure. He may have existed. He certainly existed in the minds of the Britons as a figurehead for their resistance against the Saxons.
Gather up!
Arthur is a myth for all times, a message for all times, but also a myth and a message particularly for the Britons in this dark period of their history.
The Britons were to make their last stand in an old Roman hill fortress known as Mount Badon, which many historians believe to be present-day Bath. Even the fog of 1,500 years cannot dim the glory of Mount Badon. Cracking the British defences nearly broke the Saxons. When they at last scaled the walls, Arthur united his troops and launched a crushing counterattack. By driving the Saxons from Mount Badon, the British ensured that their culture would survive.
And that becomes a turning point in history. The Saxon takeover of England is halted for a while. The Britons had a period of peace, and it's in that period that their mythology projects Arthur as the victor of Badon Hill, as the creator of a Camelot era.
The island was split. Welsh lands to the west and Saxon to the east. On the Saxon side, more than 30 kingdoms rose and fell, each vying for supremacy. Then, out of Bernicia, came a Saxon warlord determined to wrest control of all the northern lands. At the beginning of the 7th century, Athelfrith dominated many of the surrounding Saxon chieftains, plundering their treasure, their crops, and especially their women.
In the 7th and 8th century, politics was essentially perpetual endemic warfare between neighboring tribes, neighboring kingdoms. The war was fought not to destroy, not to take over. It was essentially to extract tribute from a neighboring kingdom.
A great warlord took whatever he chose. For Athelfrith, the prize was just next door. Along the banks of the great Humber River, in the region that was to become known as Northumbria. As its royal families sat at their midday feast, they had no idea of the disaster that was to befall them. Young Prince Edwin escaped, but his father, the king, was murdered. His sister was not so lucky. Athelfrith claimed her as his wife, hoping to cement his right to the throne.
Kings were simply individuals who were descended from someone who had been a king and who made good their claim to the kingship, usually through violence, by forcing everyone else who had a claim to the kingship to acknowledge their lordship.
For over a decade, Athelfrith chased Edwin from kingdom to kingdom, acquiring new lands as he tried to exterminate his rival. Somehow, Edwin survived to adulthood, but his life was shaped by exile and constant danger.
If death focuses the mind wonderfully, then being under the threat of violence or death in a fairly consistent way is going to cause you, I think, to think more clearly about what is really important to you.
In 615, Edwin fled to the kingdom of East Anglia. He sought refuge with his last hope, Redwald, East Anglia's powerful king. Redwald was sitting with his wife and son in a splendid hall that contained all that the Saxons held dear.
The great halls, which are the symbol of comfort and sociability for the Anglo-Saxons. In some sense, in the poem Beowulf, the hall is the symbol of light and conviviality.
It was a place where warriors tested each other in feats of strength and swapped stories, both of heroism and disgrace.
The Saxons are clear about what they value, what's good and true, what's noble, what's despicable, what sorts of things should be admired in a person. But I think that they understood, too, that the potential in human nature was there in moments of crisis.
For the great Redwald, the moment of crisis had come. Edwin arrived at the king's hall homeless, fatherless, and friendless. Yet he must have possessed many noble qualities for Redwald to have welcomed him. The king's friendship was soon to be tested. By harboring Edwin, Redwald had placed himself in direct conflict with the bloodthirsty Northumbrian king, Athelfrith. Their battle over who would rule the north was to change the very soul of Britain. East Anglian King Redwald had pledged to shelter the exiled northern prince Edwin. But Edwin had a dangerous enemy, Northumbria's king, Athelfrith. Like most Saxons, Athelfrith remained resolutely pagan. He was certain that the ancient gods were stronger than the Christian upstart. The older gods made no promises of an afterlife, but they could bring glory in this one for a price.
We know sacrifice was part of the Saxon religion, or at least we think we do. There's a famous passage in a Roman aristocrat who describes the Saxons invading Gaul. They plunder, they loot, and before they move away from the coast to go back home, they sacrifice 1/10 of all their captives to the war gods.
Aided by grisly sacrificial rites, Athelfrith had grown great indeed, but one prize eluded him. And so he sent King Redwald an ultimatum. Give up Edwin or suffer my wrath. Redwald faced a terrible dilemma. Saxon honor demanded that he extend sanctuary to exiles, but the risk was too great.
Over is like een zonsmeer. Ik moet afgewaard.
Redwald resolved to surrender Edwin and wash his hands of the affair. But his wife had a different plan.
Family honor is at stake. It's not a question of love, it's not a question of personal feelings, it's a question of honor. That meant that you couldn't easily forgive.
Every single layer of that culture tells us that they want that sense of sacrifice and of rising above perhaps your lesser motives to do something that at the end makes you worth celebrating.
Redwald's wife reminded him that destroying Athelfrith would increase his own fame and honor. And then their son could claim the Northumbrian throne. Once his mind was made up, Redwald acted swiftly. Before news of his decision could reach Athelfrith, he launched his attack.
Kings had to be warlords first and foremost. Kings were not generals in the modern sense. They didn't send their armies off to battle. They led their armies personally, and they led from the front.
Redwald's army did not march to war, only to the sea, the fastest way to Athelfrith. The East Anglians sailed nearly 200 miles up the coast to the River Trent. On the banks of a tributary called the River Idle, they spied Athelfrith's encampment. Redwald's forces took the Northumbrians completely by surprise.
Anglo-Saxon combat was up close and personal, and it was bloody. It was a type of combat that we don't see nowadays. You don't shoot somebody with a high-powered rifle, an individual that you may not even see when you hit. What you did was you fought hand to hand.
Redwald's surprise attack left Athelfrith's army in chaos. After nearly quarter of a century of ruthless domination, Athelfrith and his men were utterly obliterated.
Once your lord is dead, you still fight on. You're not to leave the battlefield. There's condemnation for people who leave the battlefield even when the lord is dead. They're supposed to give their lives to him because he supported their life.
No one paid for honor more dearly than Redwald. He lost his only son. In his place, Redwald named Edwin, King of Northumbria. Edwin's fortunes continued to rise when he married the daughter of another famous warlord. But the birth of their first child brought complications. His wife was Christian, among the first Saxons to accept the faith.
Some of the Saxons saw Christ as yet another god that could give them victory on the battlefield. And so some of the conversions of Saxon kings had to do with their allegiance to Christ at particular military crises and Christian conversions.
Eager for victory in battle, Edwin converted to Christianity in 627. In the name of his new god, he embarked on a bitter campaign of conquest and conversion. Pushing south and west, Edwin seized control of a huge swathe of Saxon land.
To the Saxons, Christ was a warrior who overcame death, who defeated the cross. So he was an embodiment of manliness and virtue in their society.
Edwin's men toppled pagan altars. Thousands relented and adopted their new king's god.
It's not a conversion of faith, it's a conversion of accepting the power of this new god. The type of god that most Anglo-Saxons conceived was a god of power, a god of majesty.
But old gods die hard, and sometimes they retaliate. In 633, a coalition of pagan Saxons killed Edwin. Still, the Christian seeds Edwin had planted took root and flourished. The fate of Edwin's benefactor, the mighty warrior Redwald, is lost to the mists of time. But in 1939, Saxon treasures were unearthed in a startling archaeological discovery at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk.
At Sutton Hoo, you have an enormous ship, a chamber built into it, a man laid out in that chamber with rich textiles, things from all over the world.
Many historians believe that Sutton Hoo is the extraordinary final resting place of Redwald.
The things in the Sutton Hoo burial suggest that the Anglo-Saxons and their smiths and metal workers could have done almost anything that the Romans could have done at the height of their empire.
This was an astounding find, in part because it seemed to confirm so much of what was considered to be myth and legend.
Perched high on a bluff overlooking the sea, Sutton Hoo celebrates not only Redwald's greatness, but also that of his fearsome seafaring ancestors. In time, another king was to call upon the spirit of these legendary ancestors, for a new threat loomed on the horizon that was to bring war to the Saxons. Barbarian against barbarian. Christianity. Yet after his death, his people continued to feud amongst themselves in a never-ending cycle of dynastic rivalry. Then, an outside force threatened to bring their whole way of life to a bloody end. Pagan Vikings sweeping out of Denmark to attack the eastern shores of Britain. The Saxon king, Edmund, was overpowered and captured.
Vikings could become very dangerous because even though most Viking chieftains probably had small fleets, various Viking captains could join together for a joint enterprise, and they could elect a leader, and they could have quite large fleets that would number not a few hundred, but a few thousand men.
The brutal Viking warlord Guthrum forced the Saxons to accept his pagan gods.
In the late 860s, what they realized was how weak some of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were militarily, and how divided they were. King Edmund didn't have the military power to stop them.
King Edmund did his best to resist the new order, and he paid a terrible price. His lungs were ripped from his living body and placed on his back like folded wings, a torture known as the Blood Eagle. Terrified, Saxon kings fell before the ruthless Viking chieftain Guthrum. By January 878, only one Saxon kingdom was still standing, Wessex. When Viking King Guthrum launched a surprise attack, the young King of Wessex, Alfred, had to run for his life. In the depths of winter, he escaped to the tangled marsh known as the Somerset Levels. Along with a small band of nobles, Alfred plotted resistance. He was an unlikely leader. Sickly from a young age, he had succeeded to the throne only after the deaths of his 4 older brothers.
He was a man who'd rather be reading a book or visiting Rome to talk to the Pope rather than living in a cold, wet swamp organizing a guerrilla campaign against a vicious enemy.
This is an individual who, with all of his ailments, nevertheless had to prove himself as a warrior in order to have the credibility to become king. He distinguished himself by fighting like a wild boar.
To win back his country, Alfred returned to his barbarian roots. He mounted a series of guerrilla attacks, constantly tormenting Guthrum and his collaborators.
But the Vikings were a scourge of God, just as his illness was a scourge of God. And a scourge of God which was meant to lead him and to lead his people to correction. God scourges those whom he loves. Alfred believed that.
Like an early version of Robin Hood, Alfred sneaked up on Viking camps, stealing from them to feed his downtrodden people. His raids gave birth to thrilling tales of a romantic young king outwitting the evil forces of Guthrum and his Vikings. As winter turned to spring, Saxon hearts and minds were fortified by Alfred's surprising example.
His heroic resistance in the marshes, his surprising renaissance of power, the love and delight and relief that the Anglo-Saxons feel at having a leader emerge victorious out of unusual circumstances is a kind of a rallying cry which allows Anglo-Saxon England to persist in the face of Viking invasion.
At a local landmark known as Egbert's Stone, he called a secret meeting to discover which nobles were willing to fight for him.
He was crucially placed to make a difference, and to call everybody in that society to that ideal, of course, is unrealistic. But why not? Why not imagine that you could inspire everyone?
In Alfred's presence, spirits rose. The Saxons agreed to meet the following day to reclaim their country from the Viking barbarians. On the second day, Alfred's men reached the plain of Eddington and the Viking encampment. Alfred's biographer and friend, Asa, recalled the day in all its triumphant glory.
At length, Alfred gained the victory through God's will. He overthrew the pagans with very great slaughter and chased those who fled as far as their stronghold, hacking them down.
They had no alternative, and so they surrendered on Alfred's terms. And Alfred's terms included not only that they leave his kingdom, it included the conversion of King Guthrum and all of his leading men.
As the only king left standing, Alfred became overlord in 886 and ruled the first truly unified kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. The king had proven his mettle in war, but it was in peace that he truly shone.
He created a whole new military system. He built fortified towns called boroughs, 30 of them throughout his kingdom. He manned them with 27,000 troops.
When the Vikings renewed their conquest in the 890s, they discovered a land transformed, with sturdy defenses in place and a well-trained mobile army waiting to repel them.
Austrian fast and sustain. Persons wie Jenny and Sidal, sie beroddet kommende Tag.
But Alfred's most enduring legacy was built in words and knowledge.
The Danes, taking away learned men, destroying churches. Those losses represent more than damage to a people or a political loss. To him, it's a loss of culture. So he starts on this system of education. He wants every free man who is rich enough to send his children to school so that they can learn English. If they are suited to it, they can continue on to learn Latin. But it's English first.
Not only did Alfred order important Latin texts translated into English, he actually translated 5 of them himself. Then he distributed copies to his most important nobles, a gift signifying the great value of knowledge.
He's really the person who takes all those mixed heritages and cements the idea of being a Saxon or an Englishman. He wants that culture saved because it's important to know where you come from and who you come from.
Des over sie Abend, mein Freund.
This is perhaps the reason that Alfred, alone among all English monarchs, is known as the Great. In 899, at the age of 50, Alfred finally succumbed to his lifelong illness. The Saxon kingdom continued to flourish until the Norman conquest of 1066. But even William the Conqueror could not extinguish the imprint of 600 years. For it was Anglo-Saxon ideals that continued to mold the island's culture for the next several centuries.
Out of these small beginnings of what have to be, in some sense, refugees, exiles, and pirates, blossoms the whole of the English-speaking civilization.
In every country shaped by the British Empire, the names of the towns, the spirit of the laws, the very language itself, all flow from the Saxon warrior kings. They are a direct link to the modern world's barbarian past.